folks in the room online, and it's really great. This is, sort of a guinea pig kind of class. We're trying to figure out how to use this new system here in the library so that we can really more effectively accomplish having people at home and people in the building at the same time. So thanks for being the guinea pigs on those who are aware.
So it is Wednesday, February 7th, and Rabbi Serotta, this is our second class in taking perspectives in the Mideast. And we recorded last week, we're recording this week, and if you'd like to review, you can always, it's on our YouTube channel, but if you need a link, feel free to see me.
And we're trying new things, and we'll probably continue to try new things as we go along. But this week, Vanessa's going to share the screen, and she's also added some more visual pizzazz for people at home and things like that. So we'll see
people in the room.
Yeah, so we'll see how that goes as we go along. Certainly want to leave room for comments and questions and discussion. But I do think there are these factual things that, in a way, this topic, when it comes to Israel, right, all Jews think they're experts on this. And not a lot of people have actually read primary documents, so I just want to make sure that we have some of those things under our belt, so to speak, so that we can talk with a common language about these things. So last week we started out, we were talking about the Ottoman Empire and 500 years of conquest, right? Those are those words that we have to really sort of unpack, conquest and colonization. It's how the world was built, right? I mean, it's, when we can, it's always good to compare when you're talking about Israel and the Middle East, think about America, and what goes on here. I don't hear a lot of people going around questioning whether or not America has the right to exist. Was it a colonial enterprise? Absolutely. And then think about something like the Louisiana Purchase. We bought this huge swath of land in the United States of America from France. France? How does France have the right to sell America? Right? It's only really in the present day that we even sort of started to ask the question about, for instance, the people of the Three Fires, who were the ones who were indigenous settlers around here, and we feel a little bit bad about the fact that we are on their land, but, there isn't really a great movement to return the land to the people who lived in, right? The Middle East, this crossroads between Africa and Europe and Asia, has always been conquest, right? Conquest, and I'd say colonization too, but really it starts with conquest, right? And the Ottoman Empire conquered this land at the end of the last of the Crusades. They conquered it from the Byzantine Empire, which was the last remains kind of the Roman Empire and the Holy Roman Empire, right? So this Christian empire that had conquered the land of Israel. And then the Ottomans come in and they conquer the land of Israel. And they're there for 500 years. And I would argue that on some level, only length of time makes the difference between this is a place that's been conquered and this is a place that's here. You know what I mean?
You can't forget Seward's Purchase too.
Right.
Alaska.
Yeah, it's the same kind of thing, right? And when it comes to Jews settling in Palestine, right, in this province of the Ottoman Empire, we asked that question a little bit too. I mean, the Jewish National Fund is founded at the end of the 19th century. They go around with the little boxes and they collect kopecks from, Russian Jews, and they use it to purchase land in what's today the state of Israel, and they buy it from the Ottoman landlords, right? You know, so we have deeds from the Ottoman Empire. Well, what's that worth? You know, it's like Confederate money after the Civil War, right? What is a deed from the Ottoman Empire worth when there is no longer an Ottoman Empire? So so we're stuck with this kind of hodgepodge of things that on the one hand you have people who did indeed live in towns and neighborhoods and things like that, built homes over generations in some cases. They're the whole 500 years paying their annual tribute to Damascus, which in turn paid it to Istanbul. Right? So, and it was just the way it was, and it was just accepted by the people who lived there. This is the way it's always been, right? 500 years is an incredibly long time. Right? It's the way it's always been. It's the way it will always be. So be it, right? And with World War I and the end of the Ottoman Empire, right, that all is up in the air, right? Along with, of course, the rise of nationalism, as we talked about, and different people and different movements, different clans within Islam, seeing themselves as nationalist leaders. And so we have these words, you know, conquest, colonialism, nationalism is probably a third to think about what that means. There's, you know, there's a positive side to nationalism. We might call that here in America, we might call the positive side patriotism. You know, those who are striving to make this country a more perfect union, like it talks about in our founding documents, you know, and take that enterprise really, really seriously. But then we also know that there's a dark side to nationalism, you know, where you get kind of, you know, America becomes a fetish, that it doesn't really matter whether it's democratic or not, right? It's still America. And so, you know, we have to balance that sort of darker side of nationalism with the more positive side, which hopefully gives you a sort of a cohesive group of people that works for the common good and things like that. So at the end of World War I, one of the outcomes of World War I was the formation of the League of Nations. And I think we started to talk about that last week. And by 1922, the League of Nations had a charter. And in its charter, this is that slide, Vanessa.
Okay.
They spoke specifically about the communities that used to be part of the Ottoman Empire, right?
The Balfour letter.
No, just one slide before that.
No.
It's highlighted in yellow.
Look at that.
Right. So
That was a happy.
So certain communities formerly belonging to the Turkish Empire have reached a stage of development where their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized, subject to the rendering of administrative advice and assistance by a mandatory until such time as they are able to stand alone. The wishes of these communities must be a principal consideration in the selection of the mandatory. And so this tells us that this was the plan for the former territories of the Ottoman Empire. And so these are the places that ultimately become Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and today Israel. But the Palestinian, we mentioned last week, the Palestinians were far behind the Jews in terms of their organization in that land. And so the Jews were ready to work with the British, who were given the mandate in terms of we are the ones who are going to become to reach the stage of development to become an independent nation. After 500 years of Ottoman rule, the folks that we would today call Palestinians aren't organized like that. There's no general organizational principle there. And remember, at the point when the British mandate comes after World War One, there are no independent Arab nations, right? There's no Jordan, there's no Syria, there's no Lebanon. Shortly after World War One, the first one to get some recognition is Egypt. Still a protectorate, but I think they're the first, I think in 1923. And Iraq, I think, is the second. And then gradually some of these others. And really, we talked about the birth of the State of Israel in 1948, when Jordan became a country in 1946. Right? So you're talking about brand new baby countries, and that are being formed here. France and Syria are in a French protectorate. Lebanon and Syria are in a French protectorate, and the rest is in British Union. So there was this investigation talking about the agreements that had been made between or the letters at least that had been exchanged by Sharif Hussein in the Arabian Peninsula, an appointee of the Ottoman Empire, and McMahon, a representative of the British government. And this question, we talked about this last week, right? That it doesn't mention anywhere in those letters Palestine. And for Palestinians, that's proof that Palestine was meant to be included in all these other lands that would eventually become Arab lands. And the British, in a sense, claim later on, well, we didn't mention Palestine because Palestine was obvious, right? That we couldn't possibly turn that over to an Arab ruler, right? Because of the sensitive religious areas in what is today Israel. That we're going to go back to Balfour for a minute from a letter that he wrote in 1919. Remember, the Balfour Declaration was in 1917, in the midst of the war. 1919, it's right after the war, and this letter wasn't made public until 1949. So after the State of Israel already exists, but it's interesting to see what Balfour had to say about essentially what he had just written at the height of war and now at the beginning of the mandate period. So
you want that slide?
Yeah.
I don't know it's true. It's a fake document though. Was this ever verified?
Yeah. I'm not going to show you anything. It's
No,
not
I'm
real.
not saying that you
Yeah.
weren't, but I'm just
Yeah.
saying it could have been something. I mean, it's 37 years later.
Right.
And, I'm just saying it could have been a fake document.
Well, that was in archives and things like that. It had just not been made public.
Okay.
Right? We have the same thing with, by the way, we'll talk about hopefully today the Declaration of Independence in Israel, and now we have the deliberations of the committee that wrote the Declaration of Independence, but those things weren't released until 2002.
Okay.
So, but they're really interesting. I think I've been absolutely fascinated with discussions.
I raised the question because
Yeah.
because of the internet, there's so many
Right.
fake things out there.
Right.
Right.
Absolutely. As much as we can, I try to be a stickler about it. But I would also say that one of the things I said last week is it's actually not so much that facts are in dispute, but interpretation of those facts, which is different, right? I mean, we have some people who say they have alternative facts, right? And I don't think that's really the same thing, right? For example, when early Zionists used the term colonization, they didn't necessarily mean it the way you hear it today, right? But the way it's interpreted by Palestinians is in this context, right? Today's context. So it's that's where the differences come in, and that's where you can sort of cherry pick and you pull something out and say, look, David Ben-Gurion used the word colonization. See, I told you it was a colony, right? You know, when the word colonization didn't exactly mean then what it means now, and doesn't really describe, even if it describes a period up to a certain point in Israel's history, it doesn't describe a point after that point in Israel's history, right? And this is where that whole question about, conquest, colonization, how we interpret those words and what's okay and what's not okay is, there's a lot of in the eye of the beholder stuff, even though we agree on the same facts. Yeah.
We had a farm in Israel for
Right.
10 years. It was called Kfar Mona, a village.
Okay.
Mona is named after John Mona, who was an Australian, who was a general during the First World War.
Mhm.
And he worked, I guess, for the British
Right.
in
Yeah.
the Holy Land. And
Right.
to commemorate his life, his family bought that land.
Right.
And we were always told nice papers and everything
Mhm.
showing our farm was purchased by the Monarch family of Australia. I always assumed that meant they bought it. And it's valid statement. I don't know who they bought it from.
Right. Well, that's sort of the question. And, if the Palestinians were tenant farmers during the Ottoman Empire, which they essentially were, so most likely, I can't speak to any particular parcel of land, but, unless that Palestinian farmer had been granted that land somehow from the Ottomans, then they didn't own it to sell it. But, my argument is, did the Ottomans own it to sell it? Did the British, during the time of the British, mandate, do they have the opportunity to sell it, right? We'll see that in a minute, actually, when we look at some text from the mandate document itself. But we just point out what Balfour said, if you can find that. It should be the next slide.
That's right.
Yes. So the contradiction between the letter of the covenant and the policy of the Allies is even more flagrant in the case of the independent nation of Palestine than in that of the independent nation in Syria. For in Palestine, we do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. The four great powers are committed to Zionism. And Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. In my opinion, that is right. What I have never been able to understand is how it can be harmonized with the Declaration, the Covenant, or the instructions for the Commission of Inquiry. So we just read this section from the League of Nations Charter that they're going to consult the people who live there. And when they're ready to have a nation, they'll have a nation. And Balfour points out that there's a profound inconsistency here when it comes to what we call Israel. That this is unquestionably the policy is to eventually push through a state in the land of Israel and not consult the people who live there. You can see why people didn't really want this published. Right? And this was a top secret kind of document, pointing out the fallacy in the British position.
When this was written in 1919, what the term Zionism meant to the land for Jews, or what was the definition of that?
So we're going to talk about different strands within Zionism, but yeah, I'd say it was a homeland for Jews. What it meant for the people who lived there, the 700,000 Palestinian Arabs who lived there. Those distinctions have to be made sort of carefully too, because there were also, I would argue there are Palestinian Jews who lived there, right? There were already Jews living in that land before there was ever anything called Zionism, right? All that time, all those thousands of years, there are indigenous Jews in Palestine, right? they are joined by European Jews.
They're, pardon, they're what?
Joined by European Jews from the 1880s kind of on, right? So, and the group that came in the 1880s is prior to the actual advent of the word Zionism.
So when he writes it, it's meant in a religious term.
Well, it's quasi-religious. I mean, when he talks about rooted in age-long traditions, I mean, that's a religious call, right? But it's also rooted in nationalism. And as I mentioned last week, it's partly the British Empire doesn't want too many Jews moving to England, right? So encouraging Jews to move to the land of Israel is also part of their nationalism, right? Some of the elements that we hear today, and like that crazy idea of replacement theory, white Europeans are being replaced in America, is the same kind of argument, right? The British don't want all those Jews coming from Europe.
When they use that term, not the same it should be for the Arabs who want, the Muslims who want that. I mean, only them for a lot of it.
Right.
Not use that meant as a general Holy Land Zion.
Yeah, it's not. I don't think he's suggesting that it has to be an exclusively Jewish place. And this is when we get into strands of Zionism. We get some debate about what it means, to create Zion. And there's sort of an argument today. I mean, what does it mean to be a Zionist today? If being a Zionist meant that you were in favor of the creation of a state in Zion, well, the state exists, right? So what's in a certain sense, yeah, right? So so Zionism has to be sort of redefined.
But also continue. Okay, so when I
Yeah.
think we talk about Zionism, it's
Mhm.
not just the creation, it's also the
Yeah.
continuation.
Could be, but I think it's just one of those terms that needs redefinition in a certain sense after the state exists, right?
This is one thing, but I find this a little bit disturbing that you took away land from people that have lived there for thousands of years without any real legal justification, just because the international community said, you now have Israel. That's it, guys. That's your land, and even though they didn't really own the land, which is kind of peculiar that they lived there so many years and probably lived there before the Ottoman Empire took it over.
Well, it's why there's trouble today,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that's my argument. Part of my argument is that it's not just that this is not some ancient religious battle. Some people like to put it into that context. It's these religions can't get along. This is a late 19th, 20th century problem, right? And they said no legal justification. I might argue that the only thing we had was a legal justification, right? That the British Empire said, you can do this. And they were the authority. And so they gave us the legal authority to do this. And that's how we got where we are. So we have a legal justification, but there's a different question that needs to be asked, right? So, you can go on to the next slide, which is still part of his letter. Right? One more paragraph or something in his letter. I do not think that Zionism will hurt the Arabs, but they will never say they want it. Whatever be the future of Palestine, it is not now an independent nation, nor is it yet on the way to become one. In 1919, about 30 years away. Right? Whatever deference should be paid to the views of those who live there, the powers in their selection of a mandatory do not propose, as I understand the matter, to consult them. In short, so far as Palestine is concerned, the powers have made no statement of fact which is not admittedly wrong, and no declaration of policy which, at least in the letter, they have not always intended to violate.
Double negatives.
No, it's
Even following.
it's very critical, I would say, isn't it? Doesn't it? It just smacks of this British politesse a little bit, Instead of, you are all jerks and hypocrites, and, you know, right? I'm saying, let me call to your attention that the document that you've written about the League of Nations and what's going to happen to these countries that were formerly in Turkey, you don't have any intention of keeping that promise when it comes to Palestine. Right?
This is Lord Balfour. I also have the current Lord Balfour, and streets in Israel are named with intentionality. And there's a ton of Lord Balfour streets, or Balfour this, Balfour that, Dizengoff this.
We
And-
love the Balfour Declaration,
Yeah.
and we should, right? I mean, it is the British Empire saying at the height of World War II, of World War One, that they are going to look kindly on the founding of the Jewish state. And it's exactly where the problem lies, that, you know, at the same time, they're saying, we're not going to ask the 700,000 non-Jews who live there, some of whom are Christians, by the way. I mean, don't make the mistake of thinking that the Palestinians are monolith of Islam at this time. There's a very significant portion of the Islamic community, of the Arab community, that's Christian at this time, much less so today than there was at that time. But of those 700,000, I don't have the official number, but probably in the neighborhood of 150,000 were Christians. Right? So, you know, if you visit the old city of Jerusalem, you see even now there's a Christian quarter, the Holy Sepulchre, these Christian sites and say Christian pilgrimage, but Christians have lived there since the time of the Byzantine Empire, at least.
So this is the current Lord Roddy Balfour with his famous relative's portrait. In the last 20 years, people have often been saying to me, it's your Balfour Declaration that caused all the problems in the Middle East.
Yes. I would, it's not him alone, right? I mean, there was a book that was written a number of years ago, you know, playing on what we call Israel, called The Much Too Promised Land.
Oh.
You know, that, right, Balfour promises to us, and the Hussein McMahon correspondence promises it to somebody else. And then the mandate comes along and goes sort of back and forth, right? The British mandate's actually formed in 1922. The League of Nations votes to make this area the British mandate. The charter of the British mandate itself, Vanessa, if you look at the next slide, that's
Sure.
Article 4 of the British mandate. Forms the Jewish Agency.
The British Article 4, got it.
Right. The Jewish Agency, right? This still exists
Oh, yeah.
today.
It's very powerful.
It's very powerful. They have control of a significant amount of money that they spend as they see fit. Our local JUF gives a huge amount of money every year to the Jewish Agency. They give more to the Jewish Agency than anything else that they give to. My personal pet peeve about this is that the Jewish Agency is a bit of a black hole. The JUF gives them a tremendous amount of money, and we don't really know where it goes. Not really.
The same as the Sacrament.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a lot.
It's
In
called
Hebrew, it's the Sachranu.
The Sacrament.
So, yeah, it's really, you know, in my naivete, when I came to town, I assumed that JUF gave them money the way it gives money to other places, that there was grant requests and they would pick and choose, you know, what sort of project they would like to support and things like that. But no, it's just money that goes into a giant budget. JUF has a seat at the table. That's how they describe it to me in terms of knowing where this money goes. But I've gone on several missions with JUF to Israel, and I meet with the Jewish Agency, and they give us cookies and coffee and say thank you and don't really tell us anything. We give a much smaller amount of money to an organization called the Joint Distribution Committee. And when we visit the Joint Distribution Committee, they always show us the projects that they're doing, and they're always interesting. and they're always good.
I'm not
Yeah.
really sure, I think it's the JUF, just the Chicago area, or
So,
office,
There
or
is,
the national JUF.
yeah, so in different cities, it's got slightly different names, like in New York, it's UJA, United Jewish Appeal. But they are confederated together.
As far as the other, the sister organizations, in the city, are they more transparent?
I believe that New York is more transparent. I don't know about Los Angeles, but New York is the only one who gives more money to Israel than Chicago.
If you, when you plant the tree in memory of somebody.
Yes.
JNF.
Oh, that's not the same.
Not-
National
That's the
Fund.
Jewish
The
National.
other,
What percentage of the budget that you give into, the Chicago institution go to this place in Charleston? Israel?
Yeah, I don't know what percentage, I think it's about $20 million a year goes.
So why would
to-
anyone give there without any accountability? I would give to a different Jewish organization.
tradition.
So here, in defense of all of them, first of all, the Sochanoo does do good things, which
I'm not denying that. they
Yeah, I
do.
know. I mean, they
You know?
send, shlichim, they send Israelis here that are at our camps. And there's a lot of ways that it affects us, our kids, that, and there should be full transparency because I think some of the things that they do, they're fantastic. The Jewish United Fund, I think sends more like $28 million to Israel a year. And if you want to request that it goes to certain projects, they will. I know they call my mother every year and she's given them an earful of, because I don't want to give it to this, and they're like, okay, you can give it to this or this. So at least the JUF here in Chicago will separate out your funds.
The only problem with that is the money is fungible.
Well, right.
So,
Like you can't go,
Yeah.
you can't go and see your tree that says Marion Michaels on
Right.
it.
right, but also
what they,
that,
what
you
they
know,
do, no, what they do is anybody who earmarks things, the overall thing is gonna be the same.
Right.
Right.
They just kind of set it aside
Yeah.
and the overall,
What
So,
was the other
I can give you
a
an example.
nonprofit
What was the
thing.
other agency?
Well, Jewish agency,
The
is the one
joint.
we've mentioned,
No, the other one.
JNF, Jewish
No, the
National
other.
Fund.
The joint.
The one that
Oh,
you
the
said-
Joint Distribution Committee.
So you know where some of the Jewish agency money goes.
Yeah.
When we bought our farm, the Jewish agency gave us about 10% of it. We had to pay in cash for the farm. And they gave us about 10% of what they paid. And like almost every farm, desirable farm that's sold in Israel, the owner insisted Mitaka Hashulchan. So
Yes,
we had to give them
under the table.
dollar cash under the table for half of the price of the farm. I mean, it was awful. It was awful buying. We never did anything like that here in the States, but that's the way we did it. Now, if you bought a farm in the South, like around Oklahoma or around here, the Jewish agency often paid the total price of the farm just to get people coming in, immigrants in the country, to go down there to what they call less desirable places, or down in the Navy, where they have trouble getting people to go.
And this is absolutely true, but also part of the opacity of it today is how much money is being used to subsidize the settler movement in occupied territory, right? And this is where fungibility comes into play too, because you can say, I don't want any of my donation going to this organization or that organization, but the same amount of money gets donated, so somebody else's money will go 100% to the territories because you said yours won't go.
I have a question. When we were talking about transparency, is the lack of transparency in the agency or JUF or both? Because I care personally
I don't know
about
that
having
I-
been a donor to JUF.
I don't know that I have a scholarly answer to that question. Right? You know, I know what it's like to sit in the room with people from the Jewish agency and not get any specifics.
Yeah.
And when I bring that up to JUF here, they ask, what do we get for our money in terms of knowing where it goes, the answer is we have a seat at the table. So my presumption is that somebody at JUF knows where our $28 million
Or
a year
maybe
is
not.
going.
Or maybe not, or maybe they don't care.
Right. So,
They want the seat at the table is perhaps more
Well,
important
that could be.
than understanding the allocations of the funds. So I would care to know that.
I'd like to
you
know
would or you
exactly-
wouldn't?
I would,
Yeah.
I would like to know that.
I'm, and I want to say with Vanessa, JUF does amazing things right here in Chicago.
Yeah.
There's a lot, right? I mean, this is where you as an individual have to sort of balance your choices here. And decide whether it makes sense to you to donate to JUF and earmark your funds in ways that you prefer. I make a donation every year. I will say that my donation was smaller last year than in previous years, and that was because I had concerns about the judicial reform in Israel and what was going on there. So my number went down to I am actually required by the Chicago Board of Rabbis to be a donor to JUF.
I didn't know
Yeah.
The Jewish agency to support political. Like the judge, like
Yeah.
what you said about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so, they may make argument, like, we make distinctions between 501c3s and 501c4s, one is tax deductible, one is not. Right, there may be elements like that in Israel and within the settlements too. I mean, if you're helping build schools in the settlements, are you doing something political? And, you could argue that question either way.
So wouldn't it be nice if an organization like the URJ that struggles for civic responsibility to take a position on transparency? Because to say, well, that's kind of the way it is, and if we do it, at least some of our money is going to go to fund the JUF cafe, if I think it's a wonderful place. Still, a lot of the money might be going to fund settlements.
Right.
Now, if you like that, that's okay, but if you don't like that, you should at least be aware of it. And I would think that, that organizations that focus on tikkun olam would band together and at least raise the question of transparency in a formal way. It's terrible that the organization of rabbis is mandating that you spend some of your money on an organization that you may not fully agree with.
I don't have to
I'm
be
on the
part of the
URJ
Chicago Board
board.
of Rabbis.
What?
So can I address this since I'm on the URJ board?
Sure.
URJ has taken very, very strong stands, okay, in terms of what they believe in and what should be happening in Israel.
I agree.
In fact, they have a mission going there, and they always meet with members of Knesset, so they try to be able to have influence. I don't know that they have their fingers into the agency. Okay, in other words, they may not have the information to be able to do that. So I couldn't answer that question. Maybe Rabbi could, but they certainly have huge influence. But and again, it depends on what the administration is. When we had, prior to the current administration, URJ was the Band-Aid that was keeping everybody together, to be perfect.
And I think groups like the URJ and IRAC and ARTSA, those kinds
Okay.
of groups in Israel, I mean, I like that I rode the buses.
Yeah.
And that's really good. That doesn't seem to me to be adequate compensation for reform conservative organizations to come together and start addressing the question of accountability of umbrella organizations that presume to represent us. And I have a lot of respect for the URJ.
Yeah, yeah.
But you are James, you said you were.
Right, I have never heard that that's kind of where their activities are.
So when I reduced my gift to JUF, I increased my gift to arts. Right, which it was exactly, that was the trade-off I made, and I wrote to JUF and told them that was the trade-off I was making, particularly in this time when, this was before October 7th, this was the question of the judicial coup issue, with the Netanyahu government and anything that seemed to be keeping him in power was an issue.
All right, so kind of getting back to the
Yes,
titles of
yeah.
property, is this a justification that the people in the West Bank, these right-wing people do for going after the Palestinian settlers in the West Bank? If you guys have no title, it's like vigilante type justice, we can take it over the time now?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't, it's not a simplistic thing, but yeah, I mean, look, when we get to, movements within Zionism, this becomes more clear, but there is this element of, it's both religious Zionism, which is that, in the late 1800s, religious Zionists drew their map of the land of Israel based on the Bible, and that was Israel, Jordan, and Syria, and part of Lebanon, right? That was biblical Israel from their point of view, what's sometimes called Greater Israel. So anything that was acquired either by conquest or by purchase is, to their mind, a part of Greater Israel, and it's just an inconvenience that there are other people living there. Right? I don't think it's so different from that. Right? And that's why, some of this it happened so long ago, right? Even though it's 20th century, right? The end of Manifest Destiny, really, that we just accepted, right? In the same way that Palestinians living in the Middle East for 500 years accepted that they had to pay taxes to the Ottomans, right? It didn't, it was inevitable. It happened, and that's the way it is, and that's the way it'll always be. And it's only in the very modern period, that we start to think about all the harm that that was done to Africa, by territorial expansion.
Jerry Wolf is chiming in. A 501c4 is not tax deductible because it can engage in political lobbying.
I thought that's what I said.
Okay.
It's exactly what it said.
I'm just gotta
repeating.
make clear what that,
There's a
but then
difference.
we make a distinction
tax
between those two
deductible.
things, right? So, so the Jewish agency can make that distinction, even though those terms don't exist exactly in Israel. But we are doing charitable work in the territories, right? Not political.
And when you talk to someone, you can tell immediately what their political inclinations are because, we say it's the territories, in Hebrew it's the Shetachim, and they'll say it's Judea and Samaria. When somebody says Judea and Samaria and they're referring to the West Bank,
Right.
you know immediately what their political leanings are.
And we say the green line, you know what that means too.
Right.
Yeah, and people draw maps with the green line and without the green line. Right. Does everyone know the green line?
Yeah, we should.
So,
I was going to talk about that in a couple of weeks, but we can
yeah,
always
but
have
I'll
it
just
here.
mention briefly that in a sentence that in 1948, after the War of Independence, there are lines that become the borders of the state of Israel, the de facto lines. Just keep in mind, there is no peace agreement with that war. There is an armistice agreement, so a cessation of hostilities. These are the lines, right? In 1967, in the Six-Day War, the territory of the West Bank and the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip are conquered by Israel. And the green line is the line that shows the original border from the 1948 armistice. Right? So you find maps that designate that, well, this is the official state of Israel, and this is the disputed part of the state of Israel, and the green line demarcates between the two.
I don't know if you can see its supplements.
You can see some of the green line there.
And the reason it's called the green line is because the guy who did it had a green mark.
Yeah, yeah, that's right.
It wasn't Matthew Dean.
No,
Yeah, it's not named after a contributor.
no, it's not.
Right.
So what,
And it's also, when we talk about separation barriers, they don't necessarily conform to the green line either. Right, when we talk about there's a wall, you know, between wall and part, some places it's a wall, sometimes it's a fence between Israel and the West Bank, but that's not directly on the green line for a variety of reasons.
I know this gets ahead of those, I understand now why Turkey was so involved because they were the Ottoman Empire.
Right.
But why is Iran so involved now?
Yeah.
And
So there's probably reasons beyond what I'm going to say, but this Islamic revolution takes place in Iran in 1979. The Shah of Iran is overthrown. The Shah is widely seen as within Iran in 1979 as a tool of the West. There had actually been a brief democratic movement in Iran in the 1950s. The CIA, in its wisdom, overthrew that and replaced it with the Shah of Iran. So America was very involved in that, brought the Shah to power. In the 50s and into the 70s, the only country in the Middle East that I think that was doing business directly with Israel was Iran, because the Shah was, if we want to call him a tool of the West, and influenced by the West, inspired by the West.
The capitalist.
Whatever you want to say, right? They had dealings with Israel. And so when the Shah was overthrown, one of the casualties of that movement to overthrow the Shah is the relationship with the state of Israel. And they become associated in mind of Iran with America, which becomes the great Satan, and Israel is an outpost of the great Satan. So, so that's part of it, right? The other part, of course, is just power and influence, right? I mean, the two powers are both oil powers, right? So it's Iran and Saudi Arabia, and they are both jockeying for position. And as has always been the case, the land of Israel, Palestine is the territory between those powers. And that's gone on for, that is ancient. That goes on for thousands of years, that the land, the bridge between Asia, Africa, and Europe is a piece of property that people need to have a contiguous empire. Okay. So they have had the unfortunate role of being in the middle of those things for a very long time. It was, between Rome and the Ottomans, right? Any number of different empires going back to the Babylonians and the Assyrians and various groups coming up out of Egypt, the Seleucids, and that land bridge is actually geographically. We're almost out of time. Let's go back to the British Mandate just for a minute. And, Article 4 of the British Mandate makes this very clear, right? And an appropriate Jewish agency shall be recognized as a public body with the purpose of advising and cooperating with the administration of Palestine in such economic, social, and other matters as may affect the establishment of the Jewish national home in the interests of the Jewish population in Palestine, and subject always to the control of the administration to assist and take part in the development of the country. The Zionist organization, so long as its organization and constitution are in the opinion of the mandatory appropriate, shall be recognized as such agency. It shall take steps in consultation with His Britannic Majesty's government to secure the cooperation of all Jews who are willing to assist in the establishment of the Jewish national identity. So that's built right into the Jewish mandate, to the British mandate, right? So in 1922, this is what's going to happen. Okay? Again, going back to Balfour's letter from 1919, we're not gonna, there's not going to be a corresponding Palestinian agency or Islamic agency, whatever term you might want to use here. There is no intention of doing that. The next slide, Vanessa, Article 5 of the same British mandate says, the mandatory shall be responsible for seeing that no Palestine territory shall be ceded or leased to or in any way placed under the control of the government of any foreign power. And in Article 6, the administration of Palestine, while ensuring that the rights and position of other sections of the population are not prejudiced, shall facilitate Jewish immigration under suitable conditions. It shall encourage, in cooperation with the Jewish agency referred to in Article 4, close settlement by Jews on the land, including state lands and wastelands not required for public purposes. So, and state lands at this point means the British mandate, right? They own it all now. So that's my question of where does your Australian come into this, and who does he acquire this land from? And you know, you can look that up and find out. I don't know, but in some cases, right, this was the Jewish National Fund buying land from 1897 to 1948, first from the Ottomans and then from the British, you know, and then it becomes Israel, right?
Who designated who's a Jew for the purpose of immigration? And has that changed over time?
Yeah. It has changed a little over time, and there are debates occasionally in Israel. And this was again prior to October 7th. One of the next thing on the agenda, in a sense, after dismantling the court system, was to look at the law of return and who is a Jew, and curtail immigration by certain kinds of Jews.
At that point in time, was there a definition for?
So the Jewish agency is really the one that comes up with the definition of who is a Jew, you know, so for the, you know, now from 1922 to 1947, you know, the end of the British mandate, Britain's going to go back and forth about how much immigration is allowed. They cut off immigration. They cut off immigration at the worst possible time, 1939. They say no Jews can come in. So you know, this is in part because there was an Arab revolt from 1936 to 1939 against the British. And so the British are constantly sort of writing and rewriting documents over this time period, from 1922 to 1947, you know. And so here you can see in 1922, they seem to have a pretty open-minded policy, and they want to facilitate Jewish immigration. And then as the number of Jews starts to grow, and the unrest among the native Palestinian population also starts to grow. And in fact, I argued that by witnessing Jewish nationalism, Palestinian nationalism starts to organize. Right? It's not very organized, but it starts the incipient organization of Palestinians actually talking to each other about what their future can be. Starts to take place during this time.
But wouldn't you want more Jews under those circumstances if you're being countered by, you know, the Arab population there? Wouldn't you want more Jews to
Right, well, so, even now, Israel still talks all the time about facts on the ground. So, there were about 700,000 Palestinians. A small handful of those might be that category of Palestinian Jews that I was talking about. By 1948, 800,000 Jews are in the land, right? And in 1949, 900,000 Jews come to Israel. So,
In the process of the Balfour Declaration saying this is going to be a United State, they didn't say, I mean, the Palestinians don't, they didn't say you're allowed to displace them or push them out and get rid of them.
Yeah.
I mean, we did the same with the American Indian, you could say, but I mean, when they created this homeland, the Zionist homeland, they didn't say ignore them and push them away.
Right.
They didn't say don't live with them.
There was a sentence in there that said we could try to
right,
be good about
Yeah.
the people who are there who are not.
So,
absolutely,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
And there is always that sentence, in every document, there's kind of, right? But if you're, and if you're Jewish, you look at that and say, no, isn't that the way it should be? It's magnanimous. If you're a Palestinian and you look at these documents, they don't care about us at all, right? We don't get an agency. Why don't we get an agency, right? If you really care about our rights, and as Balfour says, we don't really care about their rights.
when was the present borders of Lebanon and Syria and Iraq established? Was it early 1920?
No, a little later.
And so was there any dissent from the indigenous population that, oh, look, you see the border here, we're going to kick people out into Lebanon or from Lebanon to Syria, move it out of both Europe, moving because they didn't like the land on the side.
The most famous group that, is opposed to this are the Kurds, right? Yeah, right. I mean, here's a national group that somehow gets divided up between, Syria and Iraq and Turkey, right? And given no say in who, right? So they have their own battle. Within each of the colonial powers make the leadership of each of these countries, once they're established, they made every single one of them into a minority rule government, right? The official name of Jordan is the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. The Hashemites are a clan within Jordan. They are a minority. In Saudi Arabia, the House of Saud is a minority within Saudi Arabia, right? In Syria, Assad is an Alawite. The Alawites are a minority in Syria. In Lebanon, Lebanon has since descended into essentially chaos, and civil war, but it was the Maronite Christians, the Arab Christians, that were placed in control of Lebanon. And are the Shah of Iran and Iran. And so some of these governments have fallen over the years. Others are always worried about falling, like King Hussein in Jordan. You see what happened in Syria a few years ago. And, when we talk about Israel being held to a double standard, we can talk about that more at another time, I think. But, hundreds of thousands of Muslims were killed in Syria, Yemen, in the last few years. And it barely gets on the front page of the newspaper. Even a paper of record like the New York Times.
But yeah,
nothing like what it's recovered since October 7th.
Zionism been able to coexist with the Palestinians too. even if the Palestinians were not given their own council,
Right.
would we necessarily do that?
It's a good question, right? And it's definitely one stream of Zionism. And I think I have to stop before I get to those three streams of Zionism.
I'll be continued next week with me.
Will you do that?
Oh, yeah, I
Yeah.
love that. That's
Yeah.
my, and I was gonna preface everything and I'll re-preface it next week. I have a very romantic relationship with Israel and I've been in the Zionist youth group since a kid. And, we used to talk about Rav Kook, he's the religious Zionist, so I'm happy to take that
I'm
on.
glad you're able to take that. I will be speaking to penguins next week. I'm going to Antarctica.
Oh, take us with you.
So, yeah.
I hope you're effective.
Rabbi, you'd say one thing, I think one of the biggest, I've been appeal it's today. Just understand, you as a Jew, you want to live in Israel, you buy a house. You wouldn't think of buying it without documents, without letting it on paper that you're purchasing it from so-and-so and it's yours. But many of these Palestinians, the majority of them, maybe have lived on that same piece of land for 100 years, their family, but they don't have the documents.
But the
And
point
remember
you
the
made,
story of
point you
Rama,
made,
where we have the key to that
The
house.
point you made is that these were all big empires, and at that point, it was usually known, and they lived on, sort of, this is where they found their value. And there was no village hall, right,
To record.
there was no recorder.
I will say and it's also worth noting that within Islam, there's a difference in terms of the way business is done. The Torah forbids loaning money at interest, right? But at a certain point in Jewish history, Rabbi Hillel in the Talmud says, in the Talmud where it says you can't loan money at interest, it means you can loan money at interest. Right? I'm 180-degree turn, right? It's a well-known part of the Talmud, and it allows Jews to become, well, eventually, but even in 2,000 years ago, it allows you to buy a house with a loan, right? Even now, in modern Islam, that does not exist, right? People buy their houses and their businesses through a zakat fund. So there is no loan there. You pay cash still, even now, right? I have a friend who's an imam. He marvels at the fact that I have a pension fund. Imams have no pension fund. They don't engage in the stock market. It's because it's all about interest and it's forbidden by the Torah, right? So you have this basic cultural difference too, that so the paperwork and the changing of the guard of who's in control of the country is part of it. The cultural part of how you do business is another part of it. So anyway, we have to stop there. This is going to get those three streams, one of which is totally about cooperation.
I know.
And then you're gonna have to make a banner, a poster, and
Change to Ellen.
One stream of,
She had
the
an
stream that is
electrician.
Bye, everybody.
close to my heart.
Gone,
Comes out,
maybe he was
European
on Friday.
communism.